Okay, there's still some people coming in. I think usually it takes a couple of minutes, but I think we'll just go ahead and get started, and people can jump in as they as the time allows. So thanks for joining us today for our webinar on strategies for protecting your assets. And we have with us John Pugilese. Actually, John, how do you pronounce your last name?
You nailed it. That was perfect.
Okay, great. He is with Alliant Private Client, and he works with affluent clients and even some who are not so affluent, who I recommend them. On ensuring and protecting their assets. But these are questions that I get a lot in terms of protecting assets. It's a huge issue in the U.S. If you have any experience, unfortunately, there's a ton of litigation thanks to the lawyers in this country. That it is one of the most litigious countries in the world. So there are always concerns about making sure that you don't have a lawsuit or some other event that's going to wipe out what you've worked for. There are different kinds of exposure when we're talking about protecting assets. And I mean, I feel like there's so many different, we could have a whole workshop on this that lasts all day because there's so many different areas where we can protect our assets. We're going to be talking mostly today about protecting from creditors, protecting from outside people who maybe, for whatever reason, maybe there's a car accident, maybe a slip and fall, or any other reason that you maybe end up being the subject of a lawsuit, or a divorce can end up as something that can take your assets. So this is just something that I feel like anybody who has a pretty substantial amount of assets, that is something that they think about. So this is who I am. For those of you who don't know, Shannon McNulty, I'm the founder of the Village Law Firm. We focus on estate planning and administration. I'm the author of The Complete Guide to Legal Planning for New York Parents. So we do a lot of planning for young professionals who are raising kids in the city or outside of the city. My degree is from Georgetown. I also have a tax degree from NYU, and I'm a certified financial planner. So because I have this kind of a background, which is pretty varied, I'm able to work with clients in a more holistic manner. And this is one of the things that we do talk about, in addition to sort of their whole financial planning, the planning for their family, and also kind of how they protect their assets. And John is with Alliant Private Client Services. And John, if you just want to give a quick 30-second overview of what you do.
No, absolutely. Thanks, Shannon. So for all that don't know me, again, John Pugilese, Alliant Private Client Insurance. For those that don't know, Alliant is a top 10 national insurance broker. So a very large insurance broker that specializes in all types of insurance needs, whether that be businesses, individuals, benefits, you name it. They definitely have the specialty in doing that. Myself personally, my entire career and my entire practice has been dedicated to working with successful families and individuals across the country on their property and casualty insurance needs. That's it. That's my entire focus, which is a very unique market, and the exposures that our clients face are very unique. So making sure that we properly protect, as Shannon mentioned, their assets, not only from a property standpoint, but what we're going to focus on today, a liability standpoint, which is huge. So this is specific to homes, automobiles, collections of all type, whether it be fine arts, jewelry, wine collections, bourbon collections, umbrella policies to protect liability for as high as the limits that we need, yachts, watercraft, airplanes, you name it. Anything that's owned personally is where we specialize in making sure our clients are well protected, and having the service platform to service that clientele.
Great. And so I think this is an interesting, a lot of times we don't think about insurance as sort of, it's almost, there are two different types of loss really that this type of insurance, there's all kinds of different insurance, but generally when we're talking about property and casualty insurance, there's kind of two main types of like loss that it protects against. It protects against kind of like internal things going wrong. So you have flooding in the basement, or your dishwasher breaks or something like that, that kind of just happens. It just, there's an event that's happens into your property and your property is damaged. And then the other aspect of loss that it protects against is sort of this outside loss. And so you have this type of insurance that actually has two types of protection. So your homeowner's insurance, it will protect against your broken dishwasher, but it will also protect against if somebody is on your property and falls. So I think that's kind of interesting to kind of just think about the different types of risk that we're trying to protect against and what kinds of insurance serve that purpose.
Absolutely. Shannon, you hit the nail on the head for sure. Just from our practice, and I think for everybody on the call to understand, I think that the big thing and that we're always going to lead with when protecting our clients is the liability piece. So that second portion that you mentioned. The reason that it's really where we lead is because that's the unknown, right? That's the thing that we don't really have any tangible control over, other than this is an outside situation, whether it be an automobile accident, a slip and fall, somebody says you slander their name online, whatever the case may be. Unfortunately, affluent individuals are targets in today's society. I like to call it like the Google test, right? Like people get in an automobile accident, the first thing they do is they Google who they got in the accident with, unfortunately. And that's just the world we live in. So to be able to protect the liability is a huge piece. And, we can talk about it more, I'm sure, as we go through. But probably the biggest question I get is, how much liability insurance is enough for me? And there's no perfect answer to that, but I think it's something, it's a conversation I have every day. So that's really important to individualize that. And then the other piece is the property piece, as you mentioned, which is a little bit more straightforward. Unfortunately, not all insurers are created equal by any stretch of the imagination. And people do tend to find out the hard way, unfortunately, from time to time. When they do have a homeowner's loss or an automobile loss, these insurers aren't created equal, and these products aren't created equal. So, that's really the piece that we can control a little bit more from doing really comprehensive reviews of insurance portfolios. So yeah, there's absolutely two buckets to it, both really important, but I tend to lead with the liabilities.
Yeah, and I think that is when you have somebody, and I think this can be, people think, oh, I have my insurance, my homeowners, that this is all interchangeable, that in terms of that all homeowners insurance is sort of the same, whatever agent I work with is going to be similar, but that's not really the case. Can you just talk about how different companies can be different and how different agents can be different as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about insurance companies first. So, unfortunately, a lot of the world is, you turn on the news and you see a commercial for an insurance company like every 10 minutes. And with that, so they've really made it a commoditized, market. And a lot of, property casualty insurance has become commoditized over the years. And that's okay, I guess, for many, run-of-the-mill, individuals that don't have much in the terms of assets, like those companies potentially could be okay for them. And that's wonderful. However, for our clients, and Shannon hit on this, for our clients that have financial means, and they have properties that are of significant value, and they have, assets that potentially could be wiped out in the event of a liability claim, there are insurers and what we call high net worth insurers that have really, really robust products. So how their homeowners policy, we'll use homeowners as an example, how their homeowners policy reads specifically says the number of perils, so the number of types of losses that are actually covered by those policies is substantially different than your average homeowners insurance policy. So not to go into too much jargon about insurance, because I don't want to bore anybody, but most standard homeowners policies are what we call just an HO3 homeowners policy, where it just lists, and you can read through your policy, we cover this, and it just lists out a bunch of things. However, there's usually caps on a lot of those items in terms of how much they'll actually pay, and then they start to exclude a bunch of stuff, saying, yes, we'll cover this, but we're going to exclude this part of it. I'll give you an example, like you have a finished basement, or you have something, you have anything of value in your basement, backup of water damage, and we saw this in New York recently with some of the heavy rain we got. We had a lot of large claims from it. Was backup of sewers and drains, and people's sump pumps failed, and created a giant mess. And most homeowners policy, some completely exclude water backup and damage to basements and you name it entirely. They give nothing. Some you can buy a little bit of extra coverage on a homeowner's policy. Maybe they give you 10 grand, 25 grand, whatever the number is. Again, most people don't even realize this until something has occurred. These high-end insurance companies, again, which might not cost them much more to insure with, it's just a matter of qualifying to work with these carriers. More than likely, they provide up to the entire policy limit. So whatever your house is insured for, they'll just cover all the way up to, if it's $2 million, they'll give you $2 million. Doesn't cost them anything additional. It's just being with these insurers. So that's just one really small example, but it's really relevant because we just saw it. Again, it's just heavy water, heavy rain that creates a giant mess in people's basements. In the Northeast, we just saw it a few months ago. So with that, so to give an example of, that's how one insurer handles things. And then you get the story of, how does an insurer actually handle the claim when something has occurred? Meaning, how are you treated by that insurance company? Are they going to nickel and dime you for everything to give you, they need a receipt of everything that you own in your house? That's where the frustration comes in for people. That is not what you want to be dealing with when you have a claim. You just want a check written so that you can get your life back in order. That's the difference between a standard insurance company and these, what we call high net worth insurers. They write checks. That's the different way of handling it. And then when we talk about a broker, it really comes down to, do you have an advocate? The direct writers of the world. Again, there's not that there's anything wrong with those companies. Their products are limited, but also you don't have an advocate in the event something does go sideways, or you do have a claim, or whatever the case may be. You call a number, whether it be a 1-800 number, or you call just kind of a standard number, and you're dealing with a different person every single time you call. As opposed to, I know I have a relationship with my broker. I have to put in a claim. I can be advised on, maybe do we put in this claim? And if we do put in the claim, what are the next steps going to be? And God forbid something does go slightly sideways in the claims process, you have an advocate to talk to understand, okay, this is what's going on. Maybe we need to push the insurance company, whatever the case may be. That is the difference between, having somebody that is working with you as opposed to kind of just being out on your own and having to advocate for yourself constantly. So that's really the biggest, value add that I would say having a broker that specializes in working in this marketplace is going to bring to our insureds.
Yeah. And to be able to explain all of those different benefits or drawbacks of the coverage. And I will say, just personally, when I have, I feel like this is I'm doing an advertisement for John, but I promise he's not paying anything on this webinar. But I have sent clients his way, and I literally get emails saying, thank you so much. Like, he's just been so wonderful. So it does make a difference in terms of who you work with. And I'm so glad that we're able to have you on here. One of the things that, we're talking about sort of internal loss of like property loss, and then sort of the liability loss. One of the most concerning things I think about the liability part of it is that it's potentially unlimited, right? So if something happens to your house, like hopefully this doesn't, your house falls down, there's sort of a limit to, it's however much the house was valued at. That's the, kind of the worst thing that can happen. But if somebody gets injured on your property, has a brain injury or some kind of like very traumatic injury, the potential liability is much more than the value of the house. Right? We could have $20 million, $30 million claims. So that's why I think that kind of the liability piece of it, a lot of times people don't think of it so much, but it is probably even almost more concerning, because there is really no limit on the amount of liability that you could be exposed to.
Absolutely. I mean, that's where, people can potentially just get wiped out for everything that they've worked so hard for. And again, which is why it's the first thing I talk about with people. There's a lot of detail you can go into, and I'll share a little bit of it. And excuse me, Shannon, if I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but it's the number one question I get from everybody is how much is enough to protect me? And the really simple answer is, in a perfect world, if you don't want to take any risk, is insure yourself up to your net worth. Great. Well, in some cases that either doesn't make sense, it doesn't financially make sense, for the costs associated with it, the lifestyle that you live, like either, there's people that are worth $10 million that have, go fast boats and high-end vehicles, and that's all wonderful. They might be more exposed than the person that lives in New York City, goes up and down in their co-op and doesn't own a vehicle, but they're still worth the same amount from a financial standpoint. So the really good answer to that is, let's understand what your true risks are. And that's what the conversation is. So it's nice to start with net worth, protect everything that you have. However, there's a lot more to that conversation, which is a conversation I have every single day to truly find it. And then the way I tell people is insure yourself up to the limit that you're comfortable with. And then the way to pose it to them is you're self-insuring yourself for whatever your net worth is north of that number that you choose from an umbrella policy standpoint. And I think that helps simplify things a little bit for people of how much we're willing to take on. I'll be honest with you, numbers are going through the roof. Or payouts are crazy right now throughout the country, as you mentioned, Shannon. Like attorneys are, people are suing each other for everything. It's the biggest one. I think it's like 90% of large umbrella claims come from automobile accidents, if I'm remembering the data properly. So I mean, automobile accidents are just insane. People are paying out large numbers. I think we saw $58 million paid out in one lawsuit last year in California. So it's definitely an issue, and certain parts of the country are even bigger offenders than others. New York's definitely a state that we see some large liability claims that come out of.
Yeah, so I think that, as you were saying, sort of like a good segue into what is your risk profile? And this is really kind of almost where we start with this conversation, because like you said, if you have somebody like lower risk, you rent your own home, you rent an apartment, and you're a W-2 employee, you don't have a car, then your liability risk is fairly low. But then there are other factors that can increase your risk. So once you add on any of these, you're just adding on, like exposure over exposure over exposure. So one of the main risks that people have, I think automobile is sort of a good, I didn't even have that on there, but a lot of people have cars, and that's kind of the number one reason why payouts are made. So if you get into a car accident, you're found to be at fault, and then there's potentially big claims there. Other risk factors are certain professions are at a higher risk. Lawyers, doctors, architects, accountants, all of these individual professions, they have personal liability. So even if we're working in a business, we can be sued personally, not just the business, and that creates a huge amount of exposure. Other business owners can also be at risk. There are ways that you can kind of minimize that risk, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But they don't have quite as much necessarily personal exposure as the professionals do. But other businesses, that can be if somebody gets hurt from your on your business property, or if some product that you produce, it causes an accident. There's kind of an endless amount of claims that can come out of owning a business. Homeowners. So homeowners, that's really somebody's on your property, they slip and fall on your sidewalk, right? Somebody is over, you have young kids, their kids over playing on your trampoline. Somebody gets hurt and on your property, then that is exposure for you as a homeowner. Real estate investors, if you own real estate that you're renting out, any tenants that get hurt on that property or a guest of a tenant even, that's a potential lawsuit. Affluent individuals, just in general, it's not that that in itself will make you have increased your risk exposure. It's that if somebody knows that you have more assets, then if they do slip and fall, well, they're more likely to maybe sue you rather than the person who they don't think has any money. So just having a lot of assets can make you a target. Also, finally, pet owners. If you are a pet owner and your pet bites somebody, then that's something that can again cause exposure. So these are the things you kind of want to look at. And actually, it would be really interesting if you want to put in the chat if there's particular things that you're concerned about that would cause exposure to you, or I know we have some advisors on here as well to your clients. If you would just want to put that in the chat, that would be great, just so that we can can address the issues that, if you have any issues in particular that we want to make sure are talked about. Okay, we have a shy group today. I don't see anybody in the chat. We'll
I'll throw in a couple
but
real quick, Shannon, if you that I would just
Yeah.
kind of tack on with. Just
Yeah, please.
Domestic employees.
Oh, good one.
Yeah. The pandemic really kind of, a lot of childcare, nannies being hired and things like that. That's been a really, really hot topic. So workers' compensation coverage is essential. It is really inexpensive, absolutely essential. And also employees practice liability for people that hire those employees, for wrongful termination, sexual harassment, whatever is claimed against them. That's a really, really big one that we see all the time. And then, and absolutely just any public profile that you have just increases your risk. Again, going back to like the Google test of how fast can I find out who you are? That's definitely where we see people become targets. And anyway, those are just two that come really, and sitting on nonprofit boards is another big one. So if you're very active on boards, the boards hopefully carry their own, what we call directors and officers insurance to protect you as you're sitting on the board. But unfortunately, a lot of those boards, especially if they're smaller organizations, whatever the case is, they have a group limit, right? So if you have, let's call it 10 successful individuals sitting on that board and they have $1 million worth of coverage, $1 million doesn't go that far to cover 10 affluent people. And there's coverage that can be obtained for our individual clients right on their umbrella policies in a lot of cases. That's inexpensive to obtain just to protect you in your own nonprofit D&O exposure. So just little things to keep in mind. We see them a lot. But I would definitely say childcare is a really big one, domestic employees.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. I'm glad that you raised that. Okay, so these are kind of the types of claims, and we kind of went over some of these things, but just to kind of an overview. And this is where we talked about property casualty insurance. And I think, John, you made a good point earlier about kind of how much should you insure yourself for. And I think up to kind of like your net worth. And that does that, I guess you can just talk a little bit more about what that.
In a perfect world, like that's where we would go, right? And at some point, just to kind of go into a little detail, so insurance companies tend to be relatively similar, at least in the affluent market that I was talking about before. And those insurers tend to be very similar from a pricing standpoint and things like that, up to $10 million of coverage. So, for for your client that's got $10 million or more, like that's a no-brainer to get to that $10 million limit. Where things start getting a little bit more gray as net worths are north of that number, insurers tend to charge a little bit more money to get higher limits. So then it starts to become, okay, how much, exposure do we truly have? What does our lifestyle look like? What's our profile? What's our risk profile? That's where the conversation starts to get more detailed. And what makes sense financially from a limit standpoint to protect myself. And then how much risk tolerance do I have? So my kind of go-to answer, and I've actually been starting to change my tune a little bit just based on what I've been seeing in recent, really the last 6 months or so with payouts, is my kind of go-to answer is anybody with a net worth north of $15 million. I always say I want to insure the first $15 million. And the reason I picked that number is that's kind of where typically we see like large liability claims capping out. And that's, again, typically. There's definitely outliers, as I mentioned earlier. But that's kind of been my go-to answer. Now I'm starting to think maybe that number needs to be 20 million. But again, that's kind of like my general rule of thumb. And then obviously we start factoring all the other stuff we've been talking about. But that's where I start to have that conversation. So there's no perfect answer. It's very gray, and that's where having the advice of talking it through with somebody is really, really important. How much risk?
Can you explain the difference between what sort of like your homeowners and your auto insurance, and then the personal liability umbrella insurance? What all of that means?
Good question. So kind of at its most basic, insurance policies, homeowners policies, auto policies, whatever other assets you have, if you have a boat, whatever the case is, they all provide liability coverage. And in most cases, the most on any of those policies you can get. Again, this is the most. Most people don't even carry these limits. They'll give you up to maybe $1 million worth of coverage. Maybe most are like 250,000, maybe 500,000 in coverage. That's the most that those products are built to offer. That's wonderful. But like, let's use the example of a car accident. So you have $500,000 worth of coverage for liability coverage for bodily injury and property damage to others on your auto policy. You get in an accident with 3 other vehicles. Those 3 vehicles, you're at fault. Those other 3 vehicles have 5 people in them total. All 5 of them are claiming injury. This is a serious accident. $500,000 in today's world goes absolutely nowhere to cover those 5 people. Okay, that's their lost income. That's their medical expenses, their injuries, and then you throw in pain and suffering. An attorney's going to, go to town with that. So how do we protect ourselves? That's when you can obtain a personal umbrella policy, which is liability coverage above and beyond, in this case, your auto policy. So you got $500,000 on your underlying auto policy, and then you have an additional limit that you choose for your umbrella policy. Let's call it $10 million. So you'd have an additional 10 million. So now you have 10.5 million of coverage, so that your personal assets can't be gone at. The attorneys can't go after those personal assets. The umbrella policy is going to pay out to protect you in the event of that automobile accident. And that's the same thing for slip and fall or libel or slander, whatever the case may be. That's the beauty of an umbrella policy. And the great part about it is they're really inexpensive for the amount of coverage that you get. Maybe a couple $1,000s a year for $10, $15 million worth of coverage. It's an absolute no-brainer. And the most important coverage that our clients can get, because it's protecting the very extreme unforeseen scenario.
Okay, thank you so much, John. And I think so. There are other, in addition to insurance. So insurance is really, we want to think of it as that's like your first line of defense, is insurance. But there are other ways that you can protect against liability as well, or any kind of creditor claims. And one of the problems, the downsides of insurance is there is a limit. So, you can't really, at whatever amount that you choose, there is always the chance that there could be a claim greater than that. So there are other ways as well to kind of protect yourself in addition to insurance, or in connection with insurance, that you might want to consider putting into place as well. So the other strategies I'm going to go through, 1, invest in assets that are shielded by law, transferring ownership, alienating ownership with trusts, and fractional ownership. So the easiest one that we have here is shielding assets, investing in assets that are shielded from creditors by law. These are particular assets that if you are sued, these things are not reachable. So they're really valuable to have. They don't really cost much, especially a retirement account. There's great reasons to have retirement accounts, and mostly people think about it for tax reasons. But another reason is that it does protect against any kind of claim. So retirement accounts are not reachable generally in bankruptcy, or in some kind of claim. So those are great assets to invest in. Life insurance policies are also excludable under the law. They also cannot be reached by creditors. So, a lot of times clients have a term policy, and term policies are great for a lot of people, but they don't really, you're not accumulating anything in that policy. It's pure insurance, what we would say. But there are other types of life insurance that you can purchase that have a combination of kind of an investment vehicle and the insurance. And those are like whole life insurance, universal life. There's all kinds of different life insurance vehicles these days. And that is a way that that is something that is protected. So, you kind of have to weigh, is that the appropriate, you don't want to buy a life insurance policy just because it's protected from creditors, but it is something that you can consider in your overall analysis of whether it makes sense for you. Transfer ownership. This is probably one of the more common ways that anyone a lot of times people who are, especially doctors, dentists, who are really so concerned about these risk issues, transferring ownership. A lot of times you'll see their spouse has everything. Everything is in the spouse's name. So they don't want anything in their name. And, there can be a downside to that, because if you get a divorce, then everything's in the spouse's name. You could be out of luck in that area. But assuming everything goes as planned with your marriage, that could be an effective way of protecting against risk. Also, sometimes you'll have like another family member owning something, but you have to make sure that it's not just a sham. You can't just have somebody as a straw ownership. There are also downsides and risks to somebody else having your assets, right? What if they died? Who does it go to? Maybe it's not going to go through your will. It's going to go through that person's will. So you might not, then maybe that person isn't going to let you have access to it. So there are risks inherent in transferring ownership. So it's not really the best way of doing it, but it is a very simple way. Probably a better way of kind of we call it alienating ownership. So somebody can't reach an asset if you don't own it. So if I'm sued in a car accident or whatever, somebody tries to has a claim against me, they can only reach what I have. They can't reach what somebody else has, or they can't reach what I don't own. So if I don't own something, then they're out of luck, and it will still be protected. So a lot of protecting assets has to do with not owning it. You want to get ownership out of your name. One of the common ways of doing this is through a trust, through an irrevocable trust. A trust is set up by a grantor. Grantor is the person who sets the trust up, and it's managed by the trustee. And then you have beneficiaries. Those are the three main roles in a trust. Every trust has to have each one of those. So typically here, if you were trying to protect, say, a second house, maybe you would transfer that house into a trust for your kids, for your spouse, or both your spouse and your kids. You could even be the trustee, but you cannot be a beneficiary. So if you're a beneficiary, sort of like you're ending up collapsing the protection of that trust. But this is probably one of the most effective ways of protecting against creditors. There are some downsides to doing this. So the downside is that you can't be a beneficiary. So you have to, in a sense, give up your benefit and enjoyment of that property, or of those assets. If it's sort of extra, you have a lot of assets and you want to gift this, or you want to set this aside for your kids' inheritance, that's an easy way to do it. You could do an irrevocable trust and your kids are the beneficiaries. You're not using it. There are ways we can kind of structure irrevocable trust to even get that money back or get those assets back. But ideally, we don't get them back. If it was found that we set these trusts up with the idea that you can just get it back, that somebody was going to give it back to you if there was a problem, then we're going to be in a little bit more of a defensive posture. But just having that trust, having an irrevocable trust, already lawyers who are suing for personal injury, for example, they don't like trust. They're not really familiar with trust. They don't really understand how they work. And so that's going to already, the fact of it being in an irrevocable trust, maybe there's ways that they can poke at it, but they are not trust lawyers. And so that's just even a deterrent to any claim. So one way is they just can't get it because it's really effectively set up. And just by law, I don't own the asset, the trust owns the asset, it's for the benefit of my kids, and so there's no way they can get it. The other way is that maybe I set it up, maybe I do somehow benefit from the assets in the trust, but it's a huge pain in the butt for them to just have discovery and get all of the evidence of how the asset in the trust is being used, whether I'm using it. It makes it very expensive for them. Irrevocable trusts, as many of you know, are also used for tax purposes. And so it really, sometimes people set it up for tax purposes. It also has the benefit of protecting against creditors. So you can use it for either or both. There are other types of trusts where you can be a beneficiary. We refer to them as self-settled domestic asset protection trusts. And in New York, if you're the beneficiary of a trust that you set up, there's no protection against creditors. Then the creditors are just going to be able to reach whatever's in that trust. But in other states, you can be a beneficiary of a trust, but and also still have protection against creditors. This is sort of an ongoing battle and a sort of conversation in the trust and estates planning world as to how effective these things are. If you live in one of these states, it's very effective. If you do not live in one of these states, New York is not one of those states. New York does not recognize these self-settled asset protection trusts, then the chances of it being effective are a lot less. Even still, it could still be a deterrent. If they feel like they have to go and litigate in Nevada or Delaware or whatever, then you could end up just deterring claims. Downsides of this are, even if you can be a beneficiary, you can't be be able to get money on demand. It really has to be kind of sporadic. It has to be managed by another person, another trustee, and you can't just treat it like it's owned by you. Even if you're a beneficiary, you can't necessarily demand money from those trusts. And if you do get money from that trust on a regular basis, then that's going to undermine its protection. So the downside of a lot of these things are you can have the protection, but you can't have the owner, you can't have the benefits of owning those assets. But what you can do, what trusts do allow you to do, is to have control over them. So instead of just giving something to your spouse, putting in your spouse's name, or giving something to your child, and then having it subject to any creditor or other issues that they have, or just because maybe they're their own worst enemy when it comes to spending money, then you can keep it in the trust for their benefit, but you can still control, put restrictions on it, you can still manage it. Another way of protecting is dividing ownership. So we can, if I wanted to say I have a vacation house, and if I just own it myself, then that's going to be, then it's reachable by creditors. Say I own it with my brother, Casey. If one of us gets sued, then they could still take half of that house. But if I set up some kind of a LLC, a partnership interest, we can put restrictions on the ownership of the property. So I say I own 50%, Casey owns 50%, and if somebody sued, say Casey gets into a car accident, somebody sues him and tries to get his share of the house, which is now in the LLC. So they say, okay, I want your LLC interest, and we can say, okay, that's, if you get the LLC interest, then we can't really stop you from doing that. But what we can do is put in kind of like a poison pill provision, saying that if somebody other than me or Casey or somebody in our family then owns this interest, they are restricted from voting rights. They have a lot more restrictions on kind of maybe who they can sell it to. And at the same time, they would still be liable for any taxes that this is generated. Say we are renting it out or something, then they would still be subject to any income taxes that would be incurred on any revenue from the LLC, but they don't really have all of the benefits of owning it. And they might not even, we can even keep the income in the LLC so that they don't even have the money to pay for the taxes. So it makes it very unappealing. It makes it a very unappealing asset to own. Okay, so that is true for, you can have it even if you just have a vacation house. It doesn't have to be as a business interest. But if you have business activities, this is a whole other area where there can be exposure, whether you're operating an e-commerce business, you can have cybersecurity issues. If you have a real estate investment, this is probably the most common one we see, is you own other properties, and or you have any other kind of business where you're serving people. Any of these activities can give rise to a claim. The law recognizes that these are a different type of claim than any kind of personal claim, and they're offering some protection. The law offers some protection against claims arising out of a business, but only if you operate the business under an entity that provides limited liability. So you've registered with the state. You can have a corporation, an LLC, which is a limited liability company. You could have a limited partnership, so limited liability partnership. So any of these entities, they provide protection against business claims if you're operating the business within this entity. So say I have a bakery, and I have the bakery and I put the bakery into an LLC, and somebody slips and falls on the bakery, or they get food poisoning. They could then sue. They couldn't, if I'm operating the bakery in an LLC, they could only reach the assets in the LLC. They can't sue me personally. They could only sue the company. And so they could access any assets that are owned by the company. So the bakery, maybe whatever muffins are in there, they could access whatever the bakery owns, but they wouldn't be able to reach my own home. They wouldn't be able to reach my own bank accounts. They would be limited to whatever the company owns. In order for this to be effective, you want to make sure that you maintain any formality. So you want to keep your business activities separate, your business finances separate, and everything goes through the business entity, and keep your own assets separate. And this is something we see in as well. It's really effective for real estate investments, that you just want it, but you want to make sure to be able to maintain that liability protection, that you do maintain all of the formalities and make sure the business is operated through the entity. And this is, this is a bit of an illustration that I tried to make on how this works. So if you do own, we have XYZ company LLC. So this isn't an LLC. You can see the claim is that little hammer there. What that person can reach is only within that LLC. So you can see where that line ends in that box. They can't reach anything else. They can't reach the house, the investments, whatever. And say this person, we'll call him John. He owns XYZ company, and he also owns ABC company. ABC company is owned directly by him. And say maybe this ABC company is owns property, and somebody slips and falls on the property, then that person, that creditor can reach not only John's personal assets, they can reach pretty much XYZ company as well. So, and anything in ABC company. So that person, that creditor can reach everything. So there's a huge benefit. So if you are operating a business, any of your clients are operating a business, really you want to encourage them to operate it within some kind of business entity that provides liability protection. And this is where, insurance is still really important. You want to make sure you have insurance for XYZ company and all of these activities anyway. And if you don't have sufficient insurance, business insurance for XYZ company, then the creditor may be able to pierce that protection. So you want to both have insurance, but also the liability, the business entity protection. And this is really because the insurance, like I said before, there is a limit on your insurance. So if the claim is more than whatever your insurance policy covers, then they can still reach other assets in the business. But if you have the LLC in place, they can't reach other assets outside of the business. So whatever amount that claim is for, say you have a $10 million policy and the claim is for 20 million, they can get the $10 million policy and maybe there's $1 million of assets in the business, but that's it. They can't claim the entire $20 million because they're not going to be able to reach anything else. Okay, and then finally, business liability insurance. This is something that we just want to make sure that you have enough business liability insurance to have an effective business entity protection. And these are all of, I think there just keeps being more types of claims that are being brought. I think cybersecurity is another one that is really kind of becoming much more important these days. But you just want to make sure that your business is covered from any potential claims that it can have. And one of the most important things here is just planning ahead. So you want to do any kind of asset protection planning before a claim arises. So if somebody gets hurt and you don't have these protections in place, you can't then go ahead and start putting LLCs in place or start transferring assets into a trust. It's too late for that. And in fact, that can be a crime, and you shouldn't work with lawyers who will do that for you. But so you just want to make sure you plan ahead before there is any claim involved. So you want to do it ahead of time just to make sure that you're protected. So I think that's it. That was a pretty long program, but I think we did cover a lot that hopefully can be helpful. And does anybody have any questions? No, I don't think we have any questions. So we're going to wrap it up. Thanks for joining, everyone. And thank you so much, John, for your insight and your expertise.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Okay, take care.
Take care. Thank you.